Well, hello everyone, I'm Robyn Eckersley and I'd like to thank David Schlossberg and his fellow co-organisers for bringing us all here today. The paper I'm going to give to you was one that was originally written for a workshop on borders, political borders, and it was trying to push we normative theorists to think in less ideal terms. As a critical theorist, I always have not been an ideal theorist. I'm more of a non-ideal theorist, but certainly not an apologist for the status quo. Let me start with a quote which I think presents quite starkly the sort of challenge we're having to confront when we're thinking about people who are displaced permanently through climate change, largely due to sea level rise, but not always. It can be other reasons that people have to move. And it's a quote from The Independent, and it says, "If you're worried about immigration, then you should be terrified about climate change." And this, I think, is something we really have to deal with, because we know that the politics of political refugees is quite toxic, more so in this country than many others, and we have to deal with that toxicity or find a way of addressing it or sidestepping it in this particular instance. So what my paper does, it's called The Common but Differentiated Responsibilities of States to Support and Receive Climate Refugees. It would have been too long a title to add, "and the right of climate refugees to choose their host," but I do address that. In fact, I want to talk about that more. It's a long and dense paper, and I've got 14 and a half minutes, so I'll have to skip fairly quickly through it. But most of you know that the international negotiations now have a new agenda, the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage, and that is up for review in 2016. And I'm a political scientist, so I'm interested in policy windows, and as a non-ideal theorist, you have to jump when you see an opportunity coming up. So here's a really good opportunity to shape the way we think about loss and damage, and also to develop arguments, to get them out there, to get them debated as that review process appears. Now, there's a lot of, if you look at the negotiations for this mechanism, we know that a lot of developing countries were saying this should be a third pillar of the new treaty that will be signed, hopefully, in Paris at the end of this year, whereas the US and others objected and said it should be dealt with under the Cancun Adaptation Framework. Now, the US won, but there is still a strong push, particularly by the Alliance of Small Island States, the least developed countries, and the Independent Alliance of Latin America and the Caribbean, to make this a third pillar of the convention. So it'll be very interesting to see what actually results, what sort of text is put in the negotiations this year. So what I'm trying to do is look at the long and checkered history of the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities as they've been developed by climate justice theorists on the one hand, normative political philosophers and moral theorists, and how they've played out in the real world politics. And to keep a close eye on that, not just to note it, but to engage with it and contend with it, because there is absolutely no point trying to develop principles that you know would be dead in the water from the point of view of the negotiators. So I've gone through in the paper in the first half, and I look at the three most commonly wheeled out principles to flesh out the meaning of, let's just call it CBDR, but that includes respective capabilities. And they are the polluter pays principle, the beneficiary pays principle, and the capability approach, or the ability to pay principle. And to cut a very long section of my paper short, none of these principles are sufficient to do the job, either because they create all sorts of problems from the point of view of those asked to cough up, but also that they won't do justice to the sort of group that I'm looking at, and that is those people who have to move permanently internationally as a result of loss and damage caused by the unavoidable impacts of climate change. We know that a lot of the movement that we expect to see will more likely be internal migration, and a lot of it will probably not be permanent. Sometimes you have to move during certain seasons and then you will return. But I'm looking at that really confined case of international migration as a result of the unavoidable impacts of climate change. And I'm using the term climate refugee just as a ploy in my argument, because I want to look at the similarities and dissimilarities between political refugees and climate refugees. But I would never suggest that we use that language in any new agreement that's made, because from the point of view of peoples who are likely to be displaced permanently, they find it undignified, they don't wish to move, and they don't want to be, they think they'll be treated by like second-class citizens if they have the refugee label. And they have there's a good weight of argument to support that proposition. And so I acknowledge that, and I'm quite careful in saying I'm only using this language so we can think about these similarities and differences without wanting to keep political refugees in that second-class status. So this is quite a tricky business. Okay, so I guess what I track here is the development of ethical and justice arguments that have become more refined over the 20-odd years since we've been negotiating around these problems. So while they've become ever more refined and nuanced, and there's almost some convergence too about the need for a hybrid approach, that there's not one single principle that can do it, meanwhile, the international negotiations, there's this growing, yawning gap between the major emitters over their inability to agree about how to interpret and flesh out the principles of CBDR. To the point now, as you all know, they've given up, totally given up on that. And so the politics have moved towards each country deciding for themselves what their nationally determined contribution will be in mitigation and in adaptation, and also what they think is fair. And so the entire politics has shifted to the politics of review of these INDCs, or intended nationally determined contributions. And for me, that's the thing to get, that is now locked in. We're not going to have a principled agreement on that. And so, and we know that the Warsaw Mechanism, there may be text on that, but 2016 will be a more interesting year for those of us interested in loss and damage. And so it's quite clear that the polluter pays principle is a complete political non-starter as a basis for grounding a liability to contribute to a loss and damage fund. That will be stone dead in the water for a whole lot of reasons I can bore you with, but let's just take my word for it. The beneficiary pays principle tries to step around that by avoiding the blame game and saying, look, you are unwittingly but unjustly enriched by your long history of polluting, emitting carbon, and although you didn't mean to, so you get around the problem of excusable ignorance, you have gained considerably, and the capability you've derived is in some measure linked to that, and therefore you should be contributing more to this fund than others. But the problem is there are a lot of very rich countries that wouldn't have a big contribution to make to the fund, and why not draw on their wealth too? We need to draw on as much wealth as we possibly can, because this fund needs to be replenished on an annual basis. It's going to need to be huge, and not just for the sorts of climate refugees I'm looking at. It's going to be called on for a whole range of other reasons as well. So we need to get the money from everywhere we possibly can, and not just states, corporations and other actors. And so a blame game here is not helpful, and it won't do the job. It's just not the place to look. So we're led inexorably to the ability to pay principle. And that principle, of course, is the one that's most palatable. But the problem here is that it's palatable because states will accept it in the same way that they accept any, not obligation, but sensibility to provide humanitarian relief to undeserved harm. But they don't think it has anything to do with it. It's a question of charity. It becomes a question of charity, a form of humanitarian assistance. So the tension there is the one principle that states are most likely to accept will be accepted in voluntarist terms. And that's not going to be enough to provide the kinds of assistance that is needed. By the way, I'm not getting into a hair-splitting debate about whether loss and damage is indeed adaptation. This is an adaptation conference. If I did that, I might be kicked out and I wouldn't possibly fit into it. I mean, some say that international migration due to unavoidable impacts of climate change is the ultimate form of adaptation, and others say, well, even if you accept that, it can't be reduced to adaptation. It is loss and damage from unavoidable harm. And there's some things you'll never adapt to, and that's having to leave your country, your home, your community, the place where you used to live. I don't know how you could ever adapt to that. Okay, so the ability to pay principle does the political work, but it doesn't really solve the problem. And so let's just hold the thought there and say, okay, we can ask all parties to contribute to a fund and develop the idea of a responsibility to assist based on primarily your capability. But if you are also causally more culpable and also benefited more, so you don't have to, under the beneficiary pays principle, you can't really distinguish between those who derive their wealth. There's clean wealth and dirty wealth. And you want to get hold of that clean wealth as well as the dirty wealth too for this fund. So here we're not going to do that, but there would be a greater moral expectation that parties that were greater historical emitters and benefited from a long exploitation of fossil fuels and so forth, you'd expect them to put in more and there'd be pressure, but it wouldn't be seen as a legal duty. Now that's a problem, but it would have political legs. But if we turn it around and think, well, okay, we're not just talking about assistance here, we're talking about relocation. So if we want to think about, can we talk about a responsibility to receive, in the same way we talk about a responsibility to protect, the new doctrine in international relations. And if there is such a thing, then it could give right to a correlative right to choose on the part of displaced persons. And I think that's possible if we sever the responsibility to assist from the responsibility to receive. So let me, in the 5 minutes I've got left, walk you through that. Now, and here we need to look at the differences between political and climate refugees. Now, they're similar and they're all moving to save their lives, right? But there are two crucial differences. In the case of political refugees, the duty to receive them is a humanitarian duty and it's totally discretionary, and the quota you take is a decision you make according to your budgetary situation. The only sense in which a political refugee can choose a host state is through a regular entry, and that's increasingly taken, and that's because of the customary law principle of non-refoulement, where a country can't send you back to the place where you face political persecution. But even that choice is increasingly being taken away through offshore processing and detention. So it's not recognised as a right to choose. And one of the reasons for that is that the host states that they would like to go to are invariably not implicated in their plight. They're not responsible for their persecution. So it's a humanitarian decision to take you on. It's an obligation under the convention once they arrive on your shore, but if they're languishing in settlements, refugee settlements, then you don't have to take them. But in the case of climate refugees, we know that all states are causally responsible in some degree for the plight of those having to move. And that's indeterminate. It varies hugely between states, but we all know that all states bear some responsibility for the contribution to that injury. And that, for me, seems enough to ground a right to receive. Now, of course, it's interesting because even communitarian philosophers like Michael Walzer, who strongly defend the right of states to decide who should enter and who should have to leave their territory, will concede that when there's a particular nexus, then that changes the nature of the responsibilities of states to receive. So he used the example of the American involvement in the Vietnam War and said that the Vietnamese refugees were Americanized before they even hit America's shores. And we can think of that in the case of some political refugees where we're involved in the wars that are sending them our way. And you hear that in argument, but this is more extensive and unavoidably involves all states, no matter how big or small. And it seems that one doesn't need to call on the polluter pays principle or even the beneficiary pays principle to undergird this, because this is not about blame, and to allow states to choose the most culpable as their host is a singularly unproductive way to start a new life in a new country. But it would seem that what you need to do is address the motivational problem that states are likely to have to support an idea such as this. And again, I think you can distinguish climate refugees from political refugees here. And one is that it would be negotiated in an orderly way. They would have their documentation. They wouldn't be relying on people smugglers. And there's something about the nature of the harm they suffer that it may not give rise to the same degree of toxicity of resentment that we see with other unauthorised arrivals, for example. Now, a colleague, Luara Ferricioli, said, Robyn, you're going to continue to convert political refugees into second-class citizens with your arguments. And this is a moral hazard of your defence of, this right to choose on the part of climate refugees. And I thought, gosh, that is a problem. But on the other hand, it's a policy window that's opened up, and maybe if this can be done, it might make it easier for political refugees down the line. Because in this instance, the numbers are much smaller than what we have in terms of political refugees. For example, on one estimate, over the 100-year period between 2030 to 2130, a worst-case scenario of permanent migration estimates about 15 million people having to move. If you look at the number of refugees and asylum seekers documented by the UNHCR just in 2013, it's 16.7 million refugees and 1.2 million asylum seekers in 1 year. Okay, so that's 18, 19 million in 1 year compared to 15 million over 100 years. It's small numbers. I don't think that should spook states in the same way. So to wrap up, there's clearly no single principle that can do justice to climate refugees while also treating all states fairly. So having an ability to pay principle to undergird a responsibility to assist, to pay regularly into a large fund, I think is the simplest and most straightforward, forward-looking way of dealing with this and avoiding the blame game. But we can detach that from a general state. So we've got a differentiated responsibility to assist and a common responsibility to receive and a common right to choose. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting the politics of this is going to be easy, but I think it's a very opportune time to be starting the debate. But I think there's no way we can avoid the inevitable slippage between the agents who've caused the problem, those that have benefited from it, those who are culpable and or reckless, and those with the relevant capability to provide redress. There's always slippage above those, and we have to just get beyond that and find what's the best chance of providing justice to refugees while minimising the burden-sharing disputes amongst states. So this is my proposition. But in the longer run, I think what we need is something like a global super fund into which states and corporations contribute. And I'll finish just with one little anecdote. I attended a very interesting side event at the Lima COP in Peru last December, where they had these folk who said they could single out the top 20 corporations in terms of the biggest emitters, and they can quite precisely calculate their financial liability for particular types of loss and damage based on their relative contribution to the problem. They've got the modelling that can do that now. So, John, you say these things are incalculable. Well, ultimately they are. Huge risks and hazards like this are fundamentally incalculable, but nonetheless, we do it in torts and nuisance law all the time, and I think we'll probably see it happening in this particular area as well one day, I hope. Thank you.